What if the scariest monster from your childhood nightmares wasn't a myth, but a real flesh and blood person? In 1589, a wealthy German farmer confessed to a 25-year campaign of terror so unimaginable, including the murder and cannibalization of 13 young children, that his society had to invent a demon just to explain his existence. Executioners tore his flesh with red, hot pincers and shattered his bones to ensure he could never rise from the grave as the undead. But the terror did end in the ashes of his pyre. His legacy mutated into something far worse, a suffocating shadow that leaps onto the backs of lone travelers in the dead of night, crushing them to death under an impossible weight. This isn't just a campfire ghost story. This is the true, blood-soaked history of the Werewolf of Bedburg, and the birth of the inescapable nightmare known as the Stüpp. Imagine, for a moment, a world completely devoid of artificial light. It is the 16th century, and you are walking alone through the dense, fog-choked forests of the western Rhineland. The sun has long since dipped below the horizon, and the canopy of ancient trees above you blocks out the pale illumination of the moon. Every snapped twig sounds like a bone breaking. Every gust of wind through the hollows sounds like a dying breath. In this oppressive darkness, the human mind begins to play tricks, conjuring demons from the shadows. But in this specific part of the world, the monsters were not entirely imaginary. Sometimes, the horror was absolutely real. If you were a traveler in the German countryside centuries ago, there was one name that would make your blood run cold. One entity that embodied the absolute peak of human depravity and supernatural terror. They called it the Stüpp. Unlike the werewolves of modern Hollywood, tragic figures cursed by the full moon, waiting for a silver bullet, the Stüpp is something far more insidious, far more ancient, and far more terrifying. It does not simply want to tear your throat out. It wants to break you. It wants to climb onto your back, sink its claws into your shoulders, and crush you beneath an impossible, suffocating weight until your heart simply gives out. But the most chilling aspect of the Stüpp is not its supernatural strength or its glowing eyes. It is the undeniable, historical fact that the Stüpp was born from a real man, a man whose crimes were so unimaginably grotesque that an entire society had to invent a monster just to make sense of the trauma he inflicted. Welcome to the dark heart of European folklore. Tonight, we journey into the twisted history, the chilling mythology, and the psychological nightmare of the Stüpp. To understand the monster, we must first unearth the man. The year is 1589. The place is Bedburg, a rural town near Cologne in western Germany. The 16th century was a time of immense turmoil in the Holy Roman Empire, plagued by religious wars, extreme poverty, and the constant, lingering shadow of disease. In this fragile society, a wealthy, supposedly respectable farmer named Peter Stumpp became the epicenter of an absolute bloodbath. For a quarter of a century, the region around Bedburg was terrorized by a string of unsolved, gruesome murders. The victims were often found horribly mutilated, their bodies torn apart as if by a massive beast. When the authorities finally closed in on their suspect, they did not find a wolf. They found Peter Stumpp. Under the threat of extreme torture, Stumpp confessed to a campaign of violence that shocked even the hardened magistrates of the era. He admitted to killing at least 16 people over 25 years. The profile of his victims is what truly horrified the public. 13 of the 16 dead were young children. In a confession that defies human comprehension, Stumpp admitted to murdering his own son and devouring the boy's brain. His depravity knew no bounds. He also confessed to maintaining an incestuous relationship with his daughter and claiming to sleep with a succubus, a demon in the guise of a beautiful woman. But how did a wealthy farmer commit such atrocities? In the minds of the 16th century public, the answer could only be black magic. Stumpp claimed that the devil himself had given him a magical belt, and by strapping this cursed leather around his waist, he could physically transform into a ravenous, bloodthirsty wolf. The punishment for these crimes had to equal the horror of the acts themselves. On the 31st of October, 1589, Peter Stumpp faced an execution that was as much a ritualistic cleansing of evil as it was a legal penalty. He was strapped to a cartwheel, where executioners used red, hot pincers to rip the flesh from his body in 10 different places. Following this unimaginable agony, his arms and legs were systematically broken with the blunt side of an axe head. This specific method of shattering the limbs was deeply tied to local superstitions. It was done specifically to prevent his corpse from returning from the grave as an undead revenant. Finally, he was beheaded, and his mutilated remains were burned on a pyre, reducing the Werewolf of Bedburg to ash. His severed head was later mounted on a pole alongside the carving of a wolf, serving as a grim warning to anyone tempted by the devil's promises. The story of Peter Stumpp should have ended in the ashes of his pyre in 1589, but thanks to the relatively new invention of the printing press, his crimes became an international sensation. Illustrated pamphlets featuring gruesome woodcuts by artists like Lucas Mayer spread from Germany all the way to England, turning Stumpp into a didactic tool, a monstrous lesson used by the church and state to warn people against the dangers of sin and the devil. However, in the rural villages of the Rhineland, the memory of Peter Stumpp began to mutate. The name Stumpp, or Stemme, morphed in the local dialect into Stüpp, and the creature associated with this name began to absorb the traits of a much older, more deeply rooted local nightmare. In Western Germany, the legend of the werewolf violently collided with a mythological entity known as the Aufhocker. The word Aufhocker translates roughly to the one who leaps upon. In Germanic folklore, the Aufhocker is categorized as a Druckgeist, or a pressure spirit, unlike a traditional werewolf that hunts to eat. The Aufhocker is a spectral parasite. It does not want your flesh. It wants your vital energy. When the local werewolf myth merged with the pressure spirit, the Stüpp was born. An encounter with the Stüpp is a masterclass in psychological torture. It always happens at night, and it almost exclusively targets lone travelers, thieves, or those wandering far from the safety of their homes. The attacks occur in liminal spaces, places of transition that inherently make us feel vulnerable. Crossroads, bridges, lonely paths through hollows, dark streams, and cemeteries are the hunting grounds of this beast. The attack always unfolds in 3 distinct, agonizing phases. First is the phase of accompaniment. The lonely traveler will suddenly realize they are no longer alone. A creature, often appearing as a normal animal like a dog, will begin to follow them. It doesn't attack, it just watches, pacing silently alongside the victim, establishing a profound sense of dread. Second comes the phase of supernatural expansion. As the traveler quickens their pace, panic setting in, the creature begins to change. It grows to monstrous proportions, shifting from an ordinary animal into a hulking, terrifying fiend. The victim is overcome with a sudden, paralyzing sense of oppression and constriction, a feeling the Germans call Beklemmung. Then comes the final phase, the leap. Without warning, the massive beast launches itself through the air and lands squarely on the traveler's back. The defining characteristic of the Stüpp is its impossible weight. It cannot be fought off with a knife or a sword. You cannot shake it off. With every single step the victim takes towards safety, the Stüpp becomes heavier. The weight crushes the spine, compresses the lungs, and drives the traveler to their knees. The creature acts as a localized black hole, sucking the life force out of its prey. If the traveler cannot reach a place of safety, they will simply collapse and die of total physical and mental exhaustion. The brilliance and horror of folklore lie in its ability to adapt. As the myth of the Stüpp spread across the borders of Western Europe, it took on new, hyper-local forms, each tailored to the specific anxieties of the community. In the region around the city of Düren, the entity is known as the Hackestüpp. This variant perfectly embodies the deceitful nature of the monster. To lure its victims into a false sense of security, the Hackestüpp initially appears as a tiny, playful little dog. Imagine walking through the dark woods and finding a stray puppy. You might bend down to pet it or allow it to trot happily beside you, but the moment you let your guard down, the adorable illusion shatters. The dog mutates into an unshakable, crushing burden that leaps onto your shoulders, turning your own empathy into a lethal trap. If you travel just a bit further west to the historic city of Aachen, the steppe transforms into a creature called the Bahkauv. The Bahkauv is a highly specialized monster. It doesn't care about ordinary travelers. It is a beast specifically designed to terrorize drunken men. Often described as a deformed, elongated calf with sharp fangs, the Bahkauv lurks in the city's ancient thermal springs, sewers, and fountains. When heavily intoxicated men stumble home from the taverns late at night, the Bahkauv ambushes them. It leaps onto their backs, forcing the drunkards to carry its massive, scaly wig through the cobblestone streets. It is a terrifying physical manifestation of the consequences of vice, a myth explicitly designed to scare the men of Aachen into staying sober and returning home to their families. Cross the border into Belgium, into the mist-shrouded fields of Flanders, and the spirit of the Stüpp evolves into an even more nightmarish entity known as the Kludde. The Kludde is a shapeshifter of unparalleled power. While it can appear as a cat, a frog, a bat, or even a tree that grows into the clouds, its true form is that of a monstrous dog walking on its hind legs. It has crimson, bulging eyes, a black beak, and bizarrely, giant bat wings covered in glistening green scales. You know the Kludde is coming not by a howl, but by the terrifying, rhythmic clinking of heavy chains dragging along the ground, draped around the beast's ankles or neck. Like the Stüpp, the Kludde loves to jump on to unsuspecting passers-by, growing heavier by the second. With all this unimaginable power, how did anyone in the folklore ever survive an encounter with the Stüpp or its cousins? The rules of survival in these legends offer a fascinating glimpse into what medieval people believed could repel absolute evil. First and foremost is the power of light. The Stüpp is fundamentally a creature of the dark, born of secrets and shadows. If a victim possesses the superhuman endurance required to carry the crushing weight of the monster until the break of dawn, the creature will instantly vanish with the first rays of the morning sun. Second is the power of acoustic sanctity. The ringing of church bells was believed to create an invisible, holy barrier that demons could not cross. If a victim carrying the Stüpp hears the tolling of a church bell, the acoustic wave of divine order immediately shatters the creature's magic, frightening it away. Similarly, the recitation of earnest prayers can force the creature to dismount. For the Kludde in Belgium, survival sometimes requires quick thinking rather than endurance. Folklore suggests that if you are being chased by the Kludde, you must throw a handkerchief or an article of clothing behind you. The creature suffers from a bizarre compulsion. It must stop and tear the fabric apart, fiber by single fiber, granting the fleeing traveler precious seconds to escape into the safety of their home. And it is the home that offers the ultimate sanctuary. In almost all variations of the Aufhocker and Stüpp myths, if the victim can manage to cross the threshold of their own front door, the monster's power is instantly neutralized. The home represents order, civilization, and safety, acting as an impenetrable fortress against the chaos of the untamed wilderness. But what if the Stüpp isn't just a campfire story? What if the millions of people who believed in these creatures over the centuries weren't just gullible, but were actually trying to explain a very real, highly terrifying physiological phenomenon? Modern science and psychology have offered a brilliant, unifying theory for the myth of the Stüpp and the Aufhocker: sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis occurs when an individual wakes up from deep, rapid eye movement, or REM sleep. But the brain has not yet sent the signal to turn on the body's voluntary muscles. You are completely conscious, your eyes are open, but you are absolutely paralyzed. Worse still, the dream state bleeds into reality. Patients suffering from sleep paralysis almost universally report the exact same terrifying symptoms: a profound feeling of dread, visual hallucinations of dark, shadowy figures in the room, and, most crucially, the sensation of an immense, crushing weight pressing down on their chest, making it impossible to breathe. Before the advent of modern neuroscience, how could a 16th century farmer possibly explain waking up in the dead of night, paralyzed, feeling like a demon was sitting on his chest? They looked to their folklore. They looked to the Druckgeist, the pressure spirit. The Stüpp is the literal cultural manifestation of night terrors. On a deeper psychological level, the myth serves as a profound metaphor for the human condition. The Stüpp represents emotional burdens. Think of a time when you were consumed by extreme guilt, grief, or a terrible secret. We literally use the phrase, "carrying a heavy burden on my shoulders." No matter how hard you try to shake off these dark memories, the weight remains, growing heavier with every step you take through life. In variations of the legend where the victim is an old woman, the Stüpp becomes a metaphor for time itself. The old woman is terrified of aging. She carries a lifetime of memories and regrets, and the weight of her past becomes a literal monster trying to drive her into the ground. You might think that in our modern era of smartphones, electric lights, and scientific reasoning, the Stüpp has finally died. But demons do not die. They simply adapt to their new environment. The dark, lonely forest paths of the 16th century have been replaced by the vast, anonymous expanses of the internet. In contemporary German young adult literature, the ancient myth of the Stüpp has been brilliantly resurrected as a metaphor for cyberbullying. In the novel Ich blog dich weg, which translates to "I'll blog you away," author Agnes Hammer explores the devastating psychological impact of digital harassment. In the story, the main character, Julie, is targeted by an anonymous cyberbully operating under the username Stüpp7. The harassment begins exactly like the folklore, with the phase of accompaniment. The bully sends a few annoying, anonymous emails. Julie tries to laugh it off, calling the troll a coward. But then comes the supernatural expansion. Fake profiles are created. Rumors spread. The virtual violence bleeds into the real world. The digital Stüpp operates with the exact same mechanics as the demon from the Rhineland. It is formless. It is anonymous. It jumps onto the victim in a liminal space, the internet, and the public humiliation becomes a crushing weight that grows heavier every single day. In a chilling nod to the folklore, the psychological suffocation of the cyberbullying is described with the line, "The Stüpp places his hairy hand on my larynx. The monster no longer needs to hide behind trees. It hides behind screens. It paralyzes its victims not with physical weight, but with social isolation and psychological terror," proving that the archetype of the pressure spirit is just as lethal today as it was 400 years ago. The story of the Stüpp is a dark, mesmerizing mirror, reflecting centuries of human fear. It began in 1589 with the unimaginable cruelty of a very real serial killer, Peter Stumpp, whose crimes were so horrific they demanded a supernatural explanation. It was fueled by the printing press, which spread his infamy and cemented his legacy in blood. But society took that historical trauma and wove it into the ancient, primal fear of the Aufhocker. They created a monster that doesn't just attack the body, but assaults the mind, the spirit, and the conscience. The Stüpp, the Hackestüpp, the Bahkauv, and the Kludde. They are all physical manifestations of the things we cannot run away from. They are sleep paralysis. They are the crushing weight of guilt. They are the devastating pressure of anonymous hatred. The next time you are walking home alone in the dark, and you hear a twig snap behind you, or you feel a sudden, inexplicable chill settle heavily onto your shoulders, do not turn around. Keep walking. Walk toward the light. Cross the threshold of your home. And never forget that some monsters are born not in the woods, but in the darkest corners of the human mind.